Hello, I'm B. Douglas Caldwell, and I'm here today with Erik Anderson, author of Flutter Point, the most recent winner of Zone 3 Press's Creative Nonfiction Book Award. Very happy to have you with us today, Erik.
Very happy to be here.
So, start with just sort of a lowball question. What is a Flutter Point?
Okay, so Flutter is actually an engineering term. Flutter is essentially the oscillation in any structure. All sorts of structures are designed to accommodate flutter. So skyscrapers, for instance, are built so that they can wobble a little bit and sway. So they're not, skyscrapers aren't totally rigid, right? They allow to sort of catch the wind and disperse it.
Right.
So there are a number of famous examples of when Flutter kind of goes crazy, and the most famous example is that of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, built in I think the 1950s. It was built too rigidly, so it couldn't accommodate Flutter, and it wound up basically coming apart at the seams. Right. And so a Flutter point is the point at which that oscillation, like the natural oscillation in any structure, basically the structure can no longer contain it or sustain it, and the whole system sort of comes apart.
Now, how does Flutter Point serve? Why did you choose that as the title? How does that serve as the overall metaphor for the essays?
Yeah. So, it seems to me to be a kind of metaphor for the place that we have arrived as a human civilization. This sense of is civilization itself able to kind of disperse the various kinds of disturbances that we're experiencing naturally? Is the Earth itself able to kind of withstand these disturbances created by humans? Or does the whole thing sort of come apart at the seams? It seems to me that we're very much at this Flutter point right now. And the question is, is the bridge going to collapse, or, is it going to stay together? And, I think most of the essays, as a sort of overarching theme for the book, I wrote the essays over a number of years independently of one another, and then only when I realized that I had enough of them to make a book did I start to think about, well, what are the overarching concerns? And Flutter Point, the title essay, really stood out to me as being emblematic of what the book was trying to do, in terms of bringing together this sense of, both our beautiful and terrible human species, and our sort of imperiled biosphere. Right. And these kind of two things in communication with one another.
So what would your ideal reader get out of Flutter Point?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Maybe a stumper question. What would my ideal reader get out of it? I think, if I would say maybe a couple of things. My ideal reader would hopefully have their mind tickled a little bit. I like books that tickle my mind, that challenge my intellect, make me think about the world in a way that I haven't thought about the world before. I think if the book is successful in doing that, I think it will have achieved, I think, one of its key aims, one of the key aims that I had in writing these essays. But beyond that, I think there's another sense that, I'd like us to think as a species a little more deliberately about the choices that we make, the ways we consume, the places that we live, and to be a little more deliberate about how we go about being humans, animals on the planet. And if this book can sort of begin to raise those questions for people or frame them in ways that maybe people haven't considered before, then that too, I think, is a real key success to it.
Well, it's certainly thought-provoking.
Oh, good, good.
Loved it when I read it. So
thank you.
For me, you've succeeded.
Good, good.
So many of the essays in the book are very well researched. You've got a lot of different sciences coming in. Could you a bit of a two-parter question?
Okay.
But could you talk a little bit about your research process with getting that scientific information and how you see the sciences as they relate to literature?
Yeah, that is you know, the two-part question. Those are the second question is big, and I can say a lot about it. The first question is a little easier to answer. I wrote a piece a few years ago called "Against Research," and it's not that I hate research. I don't. I think it's very important, but I don't think I'm very good at it. So you know, that you think it is well researched is a sign that maybe I did something right. My approach to research is always, you know, I'm a bit like a dog moving through a field, right? I catch a scent and I sort of follow that scent where it leads me. And it might not be a rational path. It might not be linear. If you saw it from above, it might look, you know, zigzaggy and crazy. But that is the way that I proceed. There's some question or some need, some idea that's drawing me forward, and then I follow it. In terms of, you know, the essay that I read here last night, The Rise of Slime, that essay really came out of, you know, sort of accidentally stumbling upon some writing about jellies. And, you know, then, you know, I wrote to the zoologist at the Smithsonian, you know, asked him if, you know, we could talk, if he'd be willing to meet with me. And then I started reading some of the literature on jellies, both before and after that meeting. And I just sort of brought things together. There wasn't a plan, in other words. I just sort of followed things where they led me. I would be sort of uncomfortable as a writer coming up with a very formalized plan for my research and then carrying it out. I much prefer to sort of wing it, I should say. The second question about science and literature, you know, there's a long tradition of scientists who have been very keen on the value and the uses of literature. Carl Sagan was one. I'm just thinking about a famous quote by a Nobel-winning physicist whose name is on the tip of my tongue and I can't remember it. But you know, that beauty is the thing that the human mind responds to at its most profound level. And I think scientists appreciate that in the same way that writers and readers appreciate that, the same way musicians appreciate that. The type of beauty that a scientist is encountering might be different than the type of beauty that a poet is encountering. And yet, I think you could make the case that in both of those instances there is some similarity in that pursuit of things. What else was I going to say? But at the same time, I think writers and readers go about the world in a different way than scientists do. And I think literature makes way for the imagination, for the intuition, for associative leaps that maybe are less familiar to scientists. At the same time, I think that the humanities and writers and readers and thinkers of all sorts we can ask questions about science that scientists can't, right? Like a scientist can tell you, you know, the various attributes of a certain species, right? Or, you know, very good at describing the world, right? How it actually functions. But it can't, the scientist can't necessarily tell you what that means, right? That's where we come in.
Yeah. So besides the besides all the science writing that gets pulled into several of the essays, one other thread that comes up again and again is film. A lot of little film references in the book.
Yeah.
Could you just talk a bit about your relationship to film and how that plays a role?
Yeah. So I should say that the cover image is from a film by a filmmaker friend of mine, Jeremy Moss, from a film of his called The Site. Jeremy and I collaborated a few years ago on a short film called The Blue Record, and I did we sort of conceptualized the film together, and I did a kind of voiceover track, a kind of essay to go along with the film, short film, only about 20 minutes long. That's the only time I've made a film, but I've been very interested and engaged with film for a very long time just as a viewer and as a fan. And I think that film offered me something, especially when I was in, say, graduate school, that I wasn't necessarily getting from my reading anymore. I mean, reading is a wonderful experience and can be immersive in so many ways, but there's nothing quite as immersive an experience as watching a film. And, you know, I think the ways that filmmakers can ask questions, it's not something necessarily that writers are very good at or used to. Like an image or a series of images can be a progression of ideas, right? Like a series of images can itself tell a story, right? A film can explore an idea without ever making that idea necessarily explicit. And in that way, I think the influence of film has been very important to me. I think you can see how that kind of mode of working maybe plays out in the essay.
I think so. Excuse me. So from the first essay in the collection, you've got a really good quote. And the quote is, "If I am an animal, what does that mean for the animals?
Yeah.
What does my animality mean to me?"
Yeah.
And why do you think it's important to kind of ask that sort of question and inquire into your animal side?
Yeah. Well, I think in part because all of the signs that we're seeing in terms of the imperiled biosphere, you know, climate change, you know, the acidification of the oceans, you know, mass extinction, like we have only seen 5 other times in the history of, in the 3.5 billion year history of life. You know, we are going through what many have called a 6th mass extinction event. And that's all a result of us, of human behavior and the human way of being in the world. So, I mean, we have a long tradition of differentiating ourselves from the animals and saying, you know, we're up on this, you know, tier and all the animals are down here. And in many ways, it is biblical, right? I mean, this comes from this sense about having dominion over nature. But in fact, having dominion over nature hasn't worked out that well for nature, right? And it hasn't worked out that well for us, you could argue. So, at least not in the long term, right? So I think we need to take ourselves down a notch. And I think as individuals, we need to be a little more cautious about our ambitions in the world. And I think we need to sort of rethink what it means to be a human. I think we need a new way of being in the world that acknowledges that we are animals, and that one of the things that comes along with that is that there are limits on what we can do, right? The ecosystem and ecosystems carrying capacity, this ecosystem being the entire biosphere, it will limit us at some point. And I think we're rapidly approaching that point.
Okay, another quote I'd like to ask into, much more lighthearted one.
Okay.
There's I think it's in the essay, The Sum of Two Cubes.
Yes.
You have a remark that a conversation between two mathematicians
yes.
Goes in a direction that is, quote, both profound and profoundly useless.
Yeah. Yep.
And I like that. It's a good. It got a chuckle. But what do you what draws you to something that is in that kind of paradox?
I think that there's I think there are a couple of ways to answer that question. One would be to say that I'm drawn to those things that exist outside of some mode of productive increase, right? Like that exist in some ways outside of capitalistic profit loss kinds of ways of thinking about the world. Being able to ascertain that that a number is the smallest number that can be expressed as the sum of two cubes in two different ways, I mean, that's a beautiful thing, right? And yet, I mean, it doesn't really have any practical application in everyday life. And there's something wonderful about that. I think you could say the same thing about a lot of poetry, right? That on one level, and a lot of art in general, on one level, it is profoundly useless, right? We can't use it in the way we can use our microwave, right? Or our toasters, or any of the other many implements that we have to make our lives better. And yet it does feed us in some way. It connects us to something that is larger than that sense of life as a series of applications, right? So yeah, I would say that that there are good sort of ethical and moral reasons to be drawn to that kind of stuff, and there are also good aesthetic reasons to be drawn to that kind of stuff.
And one final question. It's a real hard one.
Okay.
What are you working on now?
Oh, okay. All right, let's see. What am I working on now? So the last few years, I've been working on a book about birds. I initially titled it "The Hater's Guide to Birds," but then I got some pushback on that. One person said that they didn't buy the premise that I would spend so much time writing about a group of animals that I purportedly didn't like. It's not that I don't like birds. It's that I'm suspicious of our kind of fetishization of nature. So the book is really an investigation of the ways that we fetishize nature, and maybe some of the problems or the dangers to that. It does, in many ways, grow out of the concerns that I started to develop in writing Flutter Point. It's a further extension of them. Yeah, what else can I say about it? It's also a book about sort of my own long apprenticeship to science and scientific ideas. I had a terrible science education, really just awful science teachers. And I know there are great science teachers out there. I just didn't have any of them. So I was well into my 20s before I learned that science could be interesting, and that it had a lot to say about the world that was of value to me. And so the other thing the book does is it sort of charts the narrative of that growth and change over time. Even as I'm sort of going through these series of birds as kind of object lessons in the way we approach, think about, treat the natural world.
All right, well, I'll look forward to seeing that. That concludes our time together.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Ben. This has been a lot of fun.